Welcome, students of Theology and Film, to this presentation on Mary Magdalene, the 2019 or 2018 film, which is one of the ones that you're going to be watching this term, and is a very interesting film, not only for what it says about Mary and for the ways that we can apply gender hermeneutics to it, but also for the ways in which it serves as a Jesus biopic. So let's keep going. I'm just going to check my recording, make sure that I'm recording. All right. And also make sure that I can hear myself as I'm presenting. There we are. All right. So let's keep going and take a look at this interesting film. So the production was directed by Garth Davis, Mary Magdalene, and Ms. Rooney Mara, who has been involved in a previous incident where, I mean, not the actress, but was in a production that was accused of whitewashing when she played an Indigenous person in a film. Jesus is Joaquin Phoenix, an American actor, Peter Chiwetel Ejiofor, who is a British actor, and Judas by Tahar Rahim. The script was written by two women, and although the action is supposedly set in the Galilee, where Jesus lived and did his work, the film was actually shot in southern Italy. And what's interesting, partly to me as a scholar of New Testament and of biblical studies, is that two well-known scholars of early Christianity and early Judaism, very well-respected scholars, Joan Taylor from London and Amy Jill Levine, acted as consultants on this film, which is partly what makes it interesting, that it says some of the things it does. A consultant is only ever a consultant, and the producers certainly make other decisions, and I think they must have in this case. As you watch, try and watch, especially this film, with a gender hermeneutic in mind. That is it a feminist film, and what does it say about masculinity and about feminism? What it means to be male and what it means to be female as defined by society, both in the case of Mary and of Jesus as portrayed in this film. The film does not seem to be quite as evangelical as some films that sometimes are watched in classes like this or produced by Hollywood for Christian audiences, such as The Passion of the Christ or the movie that we may also see, Paul the Apostle. It is less evangelical in the sense that it seems to try and preserve some of the historicity of the first century and not immediately take all of the action into the 21st. And it does try to be more overtly feminist. It tries to redeem the image of Mary Magdalene as the primary disciple. And there's a lot of argument for this, by the way. If you're interested in Mary Magdalene, there are wonderful resources out there. Don't just look on the internet, because there's a lot of not very good stuff there, but there's some really fine pieces on Mary Magdalene as a disciple that you can certainly get. Start with Tapestry, CBC's Tapestry, and there's a program about Mary Magdalene. This movie uses some of the material from the non-canonical Gospel of Mary, especially in Peter's criticisms of Mary, but it gets, unfortunately, some of the historical details wrong, some of the main ones wrong. One of them, ones that you can see, is right here by taking a look at Mary and Jesus. They're both obviously Caucasian actors who look rather more British than Middle Eastern, although, of course, I mean, what is Middle Eastern and what is British? Anyway, in our world, Phoenix has blue eyes and an American accent, which is a little off-putting for me, at least. And Mary is portrayed by a young, beautiful woman with almost porcelain complexion, whereas the historic Mary was Middle Eastern, likely much older than Jesus. This is more the important point, much older than Jesus, probably widowed or perhaps widowed, and certainly well enough off financially to be one of Jesus's supporters and the disciple supporters. So what we have is a young, beautiful woman in the role of Mary, when in fact the historical Mary Magdalene was likely much older than Jesus and in some ways a mentor to Jesus, a kind of a patron to the movement. The movie shows Mary as the only woman following Jesus, and the New Testament says that there were quite a number of women who followed Jesus, and in fact, they were the only ones who stuck with him to the end. I want you to watch, when you're watching the movie, to watch how water is used as a symbol. We've talked about this in the class, but there's an awful lot of time in the water, which is not only spiritual, but also in this case, sort of Jungian or Freudian, psychoanalytic, in the sense that water represents the subconscious in the movie. There's a lot of talk about the kingdom of God and Jesus in the kingdom of God. Water keeps reappearing as the primary symbol, and the kingdom is, or the realm of God is represented by water throughout. And God's call is also represented by the surf. Now, I've had the great good fortune to see what's called the Sea of Galilee, which is the lake of Tiberias, or the lake around which Jesus historically took his disciples and did a lot of his stuff. And although it is called the Sea of Galilee in the New Testament, by Canadian standards, it's not a particularly big lake. So it's freshwater, not salt water. And certainly a storm could build up on it, but it is not a huge lake by Canadian standards. And I don't believe there's any surf there. There would not be any surf on the lake. Jesus, Peter, and others are represented as baptizers in the tradition of John the Baptizer, and that's quite possibly the way it was. I'm sure that Jesus was a baptizer, and Mary goes into the water to be baptized, which is definitely a change in status. So in terms of historicity and text, the movie gets some things right and many things wrong, despite Professors Allen and Levine, who I'm sure, well, I know that they know these things, so these were decisions made by the producer. Magdala was and is a town on the shores of Lake Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. Portraying Jesus and the disciples as observant Jews is historically accurate, and they certainly were. And so that's great. That there are so many European actors playing the roles is not historically accurate. One of the strange things is that Peter is played by a Black UK actor whose normal accent would be British, a British accent in English, but he plays it with an African accent, which itself is a little bit strange, only because none of the other actors put on new accents to themselves. So why did they want to highlight an African accent for Peter, who is kind of a bad guy in this film? Also, in terms of theology, there's a real strong emphasis in this movie on faith over works. Jesus in the temple sounds very much like a Protestant reformer against the 16th century Catholics. God's kingdom is not to be bought and sold. And that's a problem with this film too, in the sense that the first century Jesus was very uniquely Jesus and not a 21st century Protestant. I just put this picture in for fun because Phoenix, he may still be or may not be, but he was a chain smoker when the movie was being shot. And one of the internet memes that went around was that he was constantly running off in costume to go grab a cigarette. Psychologizing Jesus's message. Again, so we're back to the theology of this. Mary and Jesus in the movie both talk about an internal kingdom and about faith as opposed to works in a very Protestant 20th and 21st century kind of a context. The kingdom is within us, almost a spiritual sense. The real Jesus preached a very real day of the Lord. He was Jewish, firstly, not Protestant Christian. Jesus was Jewish, an apocalyptic Jewish prophetic figure who preached the day of Israel's God, the day of the Lord in the sense of the Hebrew scriptures, with a very real historical effect and a very real displacement of the Romans. The movie does get right the fact that the first century in Israel was an apocalyptic and eschatological time, sort of a time when people were focused on, is this the time when Israel's God will finally take control, throw out the Romans, and vindicate Israel? A very difficult political situation. And there were groups within first century Judaism. The Pharisees and the Essenes believed that the day of the Lord would be accompanied by the rising of the dead. And this is where Jesus fits in. If you'd like to know more, take more classes from the Department of Theological Studies or from another place where you can take some good critical biblical studies classes. This is why the disciples felt that when Jesus was seen after his death, it meant that the day of the Lord could not be far behind, because the day of the Lord would be announced by the resurrection from the dead. The political situation in the first century, it also gets that fairly right. Jesus was born, grew up, lived, and died in an occupied country, occupied by the Romans. The Galilee and Judea had been occupied by Rome since 68 BCE. Although the film's statement that all of Israel was waiting for a Messiah is grossly overstated, it was an apocalyptic and a fraught age, much as ours is again now. The disciples are portrayed as would-be revolutionaries when they may not have been, and Rome is violent and ever present. So ask yourself some feminist and post-colonial questions. Use that gender hermeneutic especially, but a post-colonial hermeneutic. Who is portrayed as the default? Who is portrayed as being at the center of the action and of the interest of the camera, the lens, visually, but also in terms of the narrative? And who is at the outside? You can take a look at these questions on your own. Stop the video if you'd like and take a look at these questions on your own. I do want to point out the last two. The movie tries to be liberating towards women, but ultimately still shows men as the saviors. And finally, there's one particularly galling scene. I think if I were a woman, I would be particularly nervous about this. Uh, uh, Feminist and a woman, biblical scholar whom I know, says that said, as I thought too, that Jesus seems to sort of mansplain sexual violence in one scene where he's preaching to a group of women. I mean, it's wonderful that he's preaching to this group of women in the first century when that might not have been the case always, but he seems to be talking about sexual violence in a way as if he can tell them all about it. Other feminist and post-colonial questions. Showing Jesus as an equal opportunity preacher is inaccurate. He did have women disciples, but he was not a 21st century liberated male. Equality in the kingdom did not mean social equality in the first century, even for Jesus, although he was unusual for his time. Mary, the mother, says to Mary Magdalene at one point late in the movie, "And you love him, don't you? Then you must prepare yourself to lose him like me." The trope, however, indicated by that is still of the woman who loves an unreachable man, which is as old as every country and Western music song. And also seems to ignore the fact that Mary was probably old enough to be Jesus's mother as well, the historical Mary. Other feminist and post-colonial questions, we have the problematic person of Peter, who puts on an African accent, as we talked about, who is very hard-hearted compared to Mary, and is portrayed as Mary's opponent. There's perhaps some historical evidence that he was, but he's the great critic of the resurrection in the film. And Judas, in fact, is portrayed by Tahar Rahim, who is a radical who comes on side with Mary. So there's this interesting thing where Mary is the one who kind of carries forward the message of Jesus against these others, especially Peter, who becomes representative of the institution of Christianity. And ultimately, this movie is anti-institutional in the same ways that we've seen otherwise. Mary's vocation, vocatio, means calling. It portrays the resurrection vision of Mary. All the Gospels do state, in fact, that Mary was the first witness and saw the first visions of Jesus resurrected. But the Gospels almost never have her as the only witness. And certainly Jesus is portrayed as God. I long to know God, Mary says, as she lies alone in her room. And then the next camera shot is our first image of Phoenix, of Jesus. Mary's vocation, you can read these things. It's very anti-institutional, as I said. It's pro-spirituality, pro-Jesus, pro-faith in some ways, but anti-institutional. And it portrays Peter as the founder of the church, whereas Mary is left outside the church. And there may be some very interesting historical background to that, by the way. Was Mary, in fact, pushed out of the historical recollection of the church? I think absolutely she was, but maybe not in the way that this film shows. Mary becomes the sole bearer of the real message of Jesus in this film. Peter takes the false message and forms the Catholic Church. And so the film somehow manages to be both unconsciously anti-Semitic and consciously anti-Christian at the same time, anti-Christian church, anti-institution, I should say, at the same time. It's complicated. It's very complicated, very hard to make a Jesus biopic, even about Mary. So this one, by the way, is not a Jesus biopic because it's about Mary, but it certainly portrays Jesus in a way. The final message, Mary as apostle to the apostles. There is a kind of a woman power message left at the end of the film. And it does portray some good things about Mary, setting some details straight, that she was the apostle to the apostles, that she was the witness to the resurrection according to the Gospels. She is portrayed that way. And then she is kind of pushed out of the historical record, but it got other details, her youth, that she left her family, all of these things, that she was romantically involved with Jesus as a kind of paramour, all of these things wrong. So it's an interesting film. I hope that you enjoy it and come to it with some historical questions and some critical questions from the hermeneutics, especially of gender hermeneutics. And we didn't even talk about how Jesus is portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix, but there's a whole article on that. And certainly he is portrayed in an interesting way as a male as well in the context of the first century. So enjoy the movie and we'll talk more about it. Talk to you again soon. Bye for now.